What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. I can't believe we're already into double-digit weeks of the 2024 season. We're about to embark on Week 10 already, and the season's flown by like they always do, but it's been a blast so far, and we're only getting started on some of the possibilities here as things start to ramp up in November. Week 10 slate is a fun one. We have a top 5 matchup, a top 20 matchup, tons of very critical games in conference standings, some highly ranked teams getting significant challenges. A couple of those are on the road, and we'll be breaking it all down today. Let's get right into the main event, the top 5 collision between number 4 Ohio State and number 3 Penn State in Happy Valley. College game day will be there in the morning. President Trump will reportedly be there as well, and all eyes will be on the Buckeyes and the Nittany Lions on Saturday at noon. Ohio State is a 3.5 point favorite. The over-under is just 45, giving us an implied score of 24-21 Buckeyes. The ESPN FPI has this at 60-40 in favor of Ohio State in percentage to win the game. Both teams have had a pretty unsteady past few weeks. Ohio State, of course, went on the road and lost to Oregon by 1, and then last week they escaped Nebraska at home narrowly by 4 points. And Penn State got taken to overtime by USC a few weeks back where they won 33-30. And then last week they beat Wisconsin 28-13, which ended up looking pretty solid, but they trailed at the half, and that was a 1-point game going into the fourth quarter. Both teams are looking to really regain some confidence and head into the final third of the season with a ton of momentum if they can pull off a win in this game. James Franklin is 1-9 in his last 10 games against top 5 opponents, but Ryan Day is 1-6 in his 7 games against top 5 opponents. So something has to give there with the head coaches, and then overall with the programs. Penn State hasn't beaten Ohio State since 2016, and Ohio State hasn't beaten a top 3 team on the road since 2006. So something has to give there with both head coaches and really with the programs in general. This is a battle between two of the best defenses in the country. Ohio State is currently ranked 4th, allowing just 11.9 points per game. Penn State is 8th, allowing just 14.3 points per game. And one major thing to watch in this will be the health of Nittany Lions quarterback Drew Aller. James Franklin said earlier in the week that Aller will likely be a game-time decision, so they could be looking to back up quarterback Bo Pribula, who actually played really well last week. He was 11 of 13, which is 85%, for 98 yards and a touchdown when they needed him against Wisconsin. But starting against Ohio State is a little bit of a different animal, so definitely something to keep an eye on there. Prediction-wise, this game's always a tough one to pick. There was a stretch from 2016 to 2018 where 3 matchups between these two teams were decided by a combined total of 5 points. Penn State beat Ohio State by 3 in 2016, and then Ohio State took each of the next 2 by 1 point. So this feels like a type of game that could come down to a field goal, if not 1 point. Penn State just last year alone looked like they could have won it. That was an 8-point game in Columbus. In 2022, Penn State led by 5 in the fourth quarter, but just collapsed to lose by 13. They outgained Ohio State in that 2022 game in total yardage, but had 4 turnovers to Ohio State's 0. So they're always really close, and even though Ohio State seems to always find a way to win this game, almost always, I just have a feeling that this might be the year that Penn State finally gets some revenge. 4 of the last 5 Ohio State-Penn State games in Happy Valley have been a 1-score margin in the fourth quarter. The only one that wasn't was in 2020 with no crowd. So the last 4 games in this series that have been played at Penn State with a crowd, it's been a 1-score game in the fourth quarter. They've come up short so many times, but I think Penn State gets them this year. I think that environment will be charged up. This feels like the most even that these teams have been in a while. This is the first time that Penn State is ranked higher than Ohio State in this game since 2017. That was one of the games that Ohio State won by 1 point, and that was in Columbus. And I think it'll be low scoring. I think it'll come down to the final minutes like some of those 2016, 17, 18 type games. But I think the Nittany Lions will make the last play and earn the win. Week 10 also gives us a massive matchup in the ACC as number 18 Pitt travels to number 20 SMU on Saturday night on the ACC network. SMU is a 7.5 point favorite. The over-under is 58.5. Implied score of 33-26 Mustangs. I mentioned it in the last episode, but the fact that this isn't a top 15 matchup at least is ridiculous. Pitt should be up near the top 10, and SMU is pretty underrated as well. but they both have a major opportunity to finally earn some respect if they can win this one. Last week against Syracuse, Pitt's defense had one of the greatest performances in recent college football history. They had 5 interceptions and 3 pick sixes. All 3 pick sixes were in the first half of that game too, and they just absolutely suffocated that Syracuse offense. They're going to need another really strong defensive effort on the road in Dallas on Saturday night because Kevin Jennings and this SMU offense have really looked solid at points this year, especially since Jennings took over as QB1. I've mentioned it a couple times before, but they were switching quarterbacks for the first few weeks. But since they committed to Jennings as the starter, SMU scored 66 on TCU, who's 5-3, 42 on Florida State, 34 on the road at number 22 Louisville, 40 on the road at Stanford, and then they had a tough challenge from Duke last week and still managed to score 28 on the road in Durham. Speaking of the Duke game, SMU turned the ball over 6 times in that game and still managed to score 28 points and still somehow managed to beat the 6-1 Blue Devils on the road. So even if Pitt does force a couple turnovers again, Eli Holstein, Des Reed, and that Pitt offense, they're going to need a really strong performance as well to try to outscore those Mustangs. One big factor here is that this is SMU's first home game since September 28th, over a month. I mentioned it on the Tuesday show, but SMU played 3 road games and had a bye week during the month of October. So they're finally back home. The fans have had a long drought. I'm sure they're ready to get back into the stadium. That atmosphere should be electric in Dallas on Saturday night, and we'll see how Pitt will handle it. This game has massive implications for the ACC championship race, of course, because the loser, all things considered, would probably be out. Because whoever loses this game, let's just say Pitt, for example, they would then need SMU to lose twice in order to jump them in ACC standings because of the head-to-head tiebreaker if they both had one loss. So, and then if SMU loses, they're in major, major trouble because they don't even have the opportunity to control their own destiny or to knock any other teams out because they don't play Clemson or Miami. Pitt at least plays Clemson in a couple weeks and would have the opportunity to beat them, jump them in the standings, and boost their resume a little bit for college football playoff stuff. But the loser is definitely in dire circumstances for the ACC title race, and then that carries college football playoff implications as well. Prediction-wise, I've gone back and forth on this one all week long, but I feel like Pitt can get it done. Pitt is quite literally, right now, one of the most underrated teams in college football and AP poll history. I posted this on Twitter and Instagram yesterday, but Pitt being ranked number 18 is the lowest a 7-0 Power 4 team has ever been ranked in the history of the AP poll, which dates back to 1936. No 7-0 Power Conference team has ever been ranked as low as Pitt is right now. And I think Pat Narduzzi and that squad feeds off of it. I think they're motivated by the doubt. They find ways to win every week. And, they overcame a 21-point deficit on the road to Cincinnati, who's 5-3. They overcame a 10-point fourth quarter deficit to West Virginia. They dominated a basically ranked Syracuse team last week by 28 points. And I think they'll continue that win streak on Saturday night with a win over SMU in Dallas. Keeping it in the ACC, 5-3 Louisville travels to number 11 Clemson on Saturday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Clemson is a 10.5 point favorite. The over-under is 63. Implied score of 37-26. Tigers. Clemson has not lost a night game in Death Valley in over 11 years. They have won 22 consecutive night games at home. The last time they lost a home game that kicked off at night, so 7 p.m. or later, was October 19th, 2013, against eventual national champion Florida State. The Tigers have also never lost to Louisville, period. Clemson is 8-0 against the Cardinals since they first met in 2014. So there's a lot of history that points to this being a Clemson win, but this Louisville team isn't one to be doubted. They're 5-3 and they're unranked, but those losses are by 7 to number 5 Miami, by 7 on the road to number 8 Notre Dame, and by 7 to number 20 SMU. They've been right in every game against some of the top teams in the country, and who knows, this might be the week that they put it all together. I made a post about this on Twitter and Instagram on Tuesday, but Louisville quarterback Tyler Shuck has been playing phenomenally this year. He's quietly putting up some Heisman contending numbers, and I included him at number 10 in my Heisman rankings this week. Against Notre Dame, he had 264 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Against SMU, he had 329 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And then most notably against number 5 Miami, he had 342 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. On the season, he has over 2,300 yards, 20 touchdowns, and just 5 interceptions. So very intriguing game there in Death Valley. I do think Clemson will win it, but I also expect Louisville to really give them a game like they have everybody else and probably cover that 10.5 point spread. Next up, we have the other number 11 ranked team. Clemson and Iowa State are actually tied for 11th in the current AP poll. The Cyclones have a huge one against Texas Tech this week. Iowa State is favored by 13.5. The over-under is 56.5. Implied score of 35-22 Cyclones. This game kicks off at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN and should be a fun one. For those of you that don't know, I picked Texas Tech to win the Big 12 this year, and they suffered an absolutely devastating 1-point loss on the road to TCU last week. Just crushing. They led by 17 at one point. They fumbled in field goal range in the final minute and just stole defeat from the jaws of victory. But selfishly, I'm hoping for some chaos in the Big 12, which starts with Texas Tech taking out number 11 Iowa State on Saturday. But I need the Red Raiders to get back in the conversation to make my pick look a little bit better. Texas Tech has 2 losses in conference play, but they are currently 5th, I believe, in Big 12 standings. So it's still possible. The Big 12 is a very unpredictable conference, so who knows what might happen down the stretch. Iowa State, just like Pitt, they find ways to win. They are undefeated. They've done it all year long, and I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled out another one over Texas Tech. Iowa State beat Iowa by 1. They were in a 4-point game going into the fourth quarter with West Virginia before they pulled away. They trailed Baylor in the third quarter before dominating the final 20 minutes. And then most notably, they absolutely stole one in the final seconds over UCF 2 weeks ago. One big thing to watch in this game is Texas Tech running back Taj Brooks against Iowa State's rushing defense. Brooks is number 3 in the FBS in rushing yards per game, averaging 132. And Iowa State's rushing defense is 99th in the FBS, giving up 170 rushing yards per game. Especially with Baron Morton being banged up at quarterback, although Will Hammond actually really played well last week. I think Texas Tech will lean heavily on Taj Brooks, and if they can control time of possession, put together some lengthy drives, keep the ball away from Iowa State, keep the scoreboard close, I think they'll have a chance to pull off this upset. All right, a couple rapid-fire games here. Number 10, Texas A&M travels to South Carolina, and despite all the momentum that the Aggies have built up over the past 7 weeks, and especially after the win last week, they're just a 2.5 point favorite in Columbia this week. South Carolina came up just short against LSU earlier in the season. They lost that one by 3 on a missed field goal as time expired. They came up just short against Alabama. They lost by 2 to the Tide in Tuscaloosa, and now they have another chance to pull off an upset here over the top 10 Aggies. This game is at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC. Primetime night game, and that environment should play a huge factor. And this could be a really interesting game. 6-2 Duke travels to number 5 Miami. The Canes have finally moved up into the top 5, and now they have a solid challenge from former defensive coordinator Manny Diaz, who's now the head coach of the Blue Devils. The Canes are 21-point favorites. The over-under is 54.5. Implied score of 38-17, which, to be completely honest, I feel like is a little generous. Duke's defense has been extremely impressive at points this year, and I wouldn't be shocked if they forced a turnover or 2 and stayed in this game for a while. With Manny Diaz's defensive mind at the helm, Duke is currently 2nd in the FBS in tackles for loss with 68. They're 4th in the FBS in total tackles with 441. They're 4th in the FBS in forced fumbles with 12, and they're 13th in the FBS in sacks with 24. So I really wouldn't be surprised if they were able to give Cam Ward and Damian Martinez and this Miami offense a little bit of trouble and potentially keep this game much closer than a lot of people are expecting. Florida and number 2 Georgia face off in Jacksonville at the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. If this game was played in week 3, I think Georgia might have won it by like 100 points. But over the past few weeks, it has steadily become more and more interesting. Georgia's a 16.5 point favorite. The over-under is 52.5. Implied score of 34-18 Dogs. Despite their record, though, and the loss of starting quarterback Graham Mertz, Florida has really been all right this season. They got crushed out of the gate by Miami. They just didn't seem like they were fully prepared for how good Miami was going to be this year, as the Canes are now up to AP number 5. But they played a relatively decent game against now number 10 Texas A&M. They lost that one 33-20, and they lost a game that they really should have won on the road in Neyland against now number 7 Tennessee. So they have 3 losses, all to top 10 teams. They lost that Tennessee game in overtime, and largely because of clock management problems and a fumble at the goal line, like an inch from the end zone. They are a hair from being a 5-2 team and one that could be ranked. With the injury to Mertz, DJ Lagway is now the main guy there at quarterback, and he and Mertz had been splitting time anyway for most of the year, but he's now the main and only guy. He was a 5-star and the number 1 quarterback in the class of 2024, and he's played relatively well in his time on the field so far this year. Florida's going to have to play a near-perfect game if they want to win this one and keep it competitive, but if Lagway can catch fire like he has at certain points this year, and if Jaden Ball and Montrell Johnson can break a couple solid runs out of the backfield, and if Elijah Badger and Shimere Dike can continue doing what they've been doing for that receiving core, I think this game will be a lot closer than most people expect. And the defense has been solid lately for Florida. They got just boat raced by Miami in week 1, but since then it looks like there's been steady improvement week after week after week for this Gators team. So they need to force Carson Beck probably into an interception, potentially 2. But like I said, I think this game will be a lot closer than most of the public probably expects. And lastly, a couple more interesting games here. Number 1 Oregon travels to Michigan. And this game looked at the beginning of the year like it could be one of the biggest games of the season, but now I'm really not expecting much from this game because of Michigan's inability to score and how well Oregon's been defensively lately. But this is just a 15-point spread, which is about like a touchdown less than I probably would have expected. So the fact that this is a closer spread than Florida-Georgia is really, really peculiar. But who knows, with Oregon having to make a cross-country trip from Eugene out to Ann Arbor, teams that have made that cross-country trip in the Big Ten have really not fared super well this year. And I mean, like just for example, Ohio State going out to Oregon, they lost. Penn State going out to USC, they got taken into overtime by a team who now has 4 losses. USC going out to Michigan, they lost. USC going to Minnesota, they lost. So for a while there, it was basically every team that made that cross-country trip either lost or snuck away with a close win. But yeah, who knows, between the Ducks and the Wolverines, could end up being a tight one. Then Virginia Tech at Syracuse. The Orange looked to bounce back from that horrendous showing against Pitt last week, and the Hokies, they're just like a tiger right now, just hiding in the tall grass, just sneaking around. Their record's 5-3, but they have 1 loss in ACC play. They had 2 non-conference losses at the beginning of the season, but they're just sneaking around, waiting for one of those top teams in the ACC to drop a game for them to be able to attack and get back into the conversation. And they're quietly still a contender for the ACC title, and they've played really well lately. And they get Clemson coming to town in a few weeks, but in order to stay alive, they have to beat Syracuse at noon on Saturday. And then number 19 Ole Miss at Arkansas. The Rebels are a 7-point favorite, over/under of 53.5, implied score of 30-23 Ole Miss, as they look to keep their college football playoff hopes alive. All right, let's get into last week's picks. In week 9, we went 7-5. That brings us to 52-30 on the year, still hitting right around 63.4%. Could be better, could be much worse, so I'll take being above 500. We have been every single week of the season. So, as usual, I want to preface by saying that if you don't invest any money into these games, just keep it that way. You're not missing out on much. There is far more losing than there is winning. And thankfully, though, things have been on the winning side here for all of this season. But, don't believe all the stuff out there on social media and in commercials, and a lot of that is largely nonsense. If you don't want to wager on any games yourself, but maybe find the premise of it interesting, or if you just like looking at point spreads and all that, feel free to stick around for a couple minutes. I'm going to give out a few picks, and if you don't care to hear about it at all, feel free to check out now. First up, we have North Carolina minus 2.5 on the road at Florida State. I really like the way that the Tar Heels have been playing over the past month. They're 2-2 in that span, so that might sound a little weird. But their losses are to Duke, a game that they led 20-0. They led 20-0 and lost that game 21-20, I believe. And the other loss is to undefeated Pitt, who they were tied with going into the fourth quarter. So their record might not indicate that they've kind of steadily been improving since that inexplicable performance against James Madison where they gave up 70. But outside of that, over the past month here, they're 2-2, but these games have been pretty solid, and the Heels look like they're improving. After last week's blowout loss to rival Miami, Florida State is now 1-7, officially bowl ineligible. I don't know what the mood is or what the buy-in from the players is around the program anymore. They're just in total disarray and in a position that I don't think they ever could have imagined being in with their hopes that they had coming into the season. So Mac Brown is 0-11 all-time against his alma mater, Florida State. But Duke broke their winless 0-22 streak against the Seminoles earlier this season, and I think Mac Brown might do the same. I think UNC beats Florida State by a field goal plus on Saturday afternoon. I also have Louisville running back Isaac Brown over 62.5 rushing yards against Clemson. The only place that Clemson really hasn't been all that impressive since the Georgia game is their rushing defense. They gave up over 200 yards on the ground at Stanford, and Brown's just been phenomenal lately for the Cardinals. He had 72 yards on Notre Dame, 172 yards on SMU, 146 yards and 2 touchdowns on Virginia, 56 yards and a touchdown on Miami, and 85 yards and 2 touchdowns last week on Boston College. I think with the combination of Clemson's rushing defense not being super elite lately, they had a couple linemen out for a while, but that combined with Brown just running wild lately, I think he'll get over 62.5 yards on the ground. Then I have Texas Tech plus 13.5 against Iowa State. I picked them to win the Big 12, and it wasn't based on nothing. I really do believe in the talent that the Red Raiders have. Like I mentioned earlier, if Taj Brooks can have a big game, if they can establish the run, put together some long drives, shorten the game, I think Texas Tech will not only stay within 13.5, but potentially pull off the win. Next up, we have Arkansas tight end Luke Hasz over 22.5 receiving yards against number 19 Ole Miss. I feel like he's a very underrated weapon for them that's starting to get used a little bit more week to week. 3 weeks ago, he had 1 reception for 16 yards on Tennessee. 2 weeks ago, he had 2 receptions for 22 yards against LSU. And last week, he had 4 receptions for 59 yards and 2 touchdowns on Mississippi State. I think they're trying to work him into the game plan more to pull off a win over Ole Miss, and I can definitely see him having over 22.5 receiving yards. And lastly, I have Memphis -7 over UTSA. I think Memphis has been one of the most forgotten about teams all season long. They're 7-1, and their only loss was a heartbreaker in a shootout on the road at Navy like a month and a half ago. And UTSA has struggled a bit this year. They just had a complete collapse in a loss to Tulsa last week. They also have losses to Rice, East Carolina, and Texas State, as well as a 56-7 loss to Texas. I like Memphis to win that one by a touchdown or more. That's going to wrap up this episode of the CFB Kings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in, and thank you for making it all the way to the end. Week 10 has some serious potential to shake things up a bit, and we're guaranteed that a top 5 team loses. We also have a top 20 matchup in Dallas as well, and who knows what types of upsets we could get along the way. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and follow if you're listening on Spotify, and definitely go check out @CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.